My name is Sarah, and I'm here to share a chilling story that happened to my boyfriend Jake and I on his birthday. Jake decided he wanted to go on a ghost walk through an old, derelict prison, and let me tell you, it was an experience we'll never forget. It was a moonless night when we arrived at the prison. We joined a group of thrill seekers led by a bunch of experienced ghost hunters and mediums. Everyone was wearing dark clothes and carrying all sorts of ghost hunting gadgets, which honestly gave me the creeps right from the start, although I wasn't really a believer in the paranormal. The prison itself was a grim, towering structure. The iron gates creaked open as we walked through, the sound echoing in the eerie silence of the night. After exploring various sections of the prison, our guide, a medium named Emily, approached Jake and I. She looked at me with an intense gaze that made me kind of nervously laugh. She said, "You, young lady, have a spirit that has taken a liking to you. It's been following you for a while now." I exchanged a nervous glance with Jake. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Jake squeezed my hand reassuringly, but his eyes showed unease. Emily asked if I'd be willing to participate in a test to ask the spirit to reveal itself to the group. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. I nodded, and Emily led us to a dimly lit corridor deep inside the prison. The walls seemed to close in on us as we walked, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. Emily explained that the test would involve using a technique called table tipping. It's a method where we place our hands on a small table and ask the spirit to communicate with us by tilting the table. I reluctantly agreed, and we gathered around a small wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. The medium, Emily, placed her hands on the table alongside Jake and me. We dimmed the lights further, leaving just a single flickering candle as our only source of illumination. Emily began speaking in a low, haunting tone, calling out to the spirit that supposedly followed me. The rest of the group all stood in front of me in the shadows, in pure silence, waiting. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The silence was broken only by Emily's soft chants. I began to doubt the whole thing, thinking it was just a way to spook us. But then, the room grew colder, and I could feel an odd, tingling sensation in my fingertips. The table beneath our hands started to tremble ever so slightly. My heart raced as the table slowly began to tip. It was subtle at first, but then it gained momentum, tilting more and more. Jake and I exchanged terrified glances as the table seemed to respond to Emily's questions. It answered with a series of tilts, leaning toward yes or no in response to her questions. Emily asked the spirit to identify itself, and the table spelled out S-A-R-A-H, which was my name. I hadn't told this to anyone there that night. My hands trembled on the table as I tried to make sense of what was happening. It felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. But the worst was yet to come. Emily continued to communicate with the spirit, and it became increasingly agitated. The table tipped violently, and then the candle flickered and extinguished itself. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I screamed, and Jake and I pulled our hands away from the table. Emily hurriedly lit another candle, revealing a chilling sight. There, in the dim light, we saw a handprint, dark and ghostly, imprinted on my shoulder. My heart pounded as the reality of the situation sank in. Had we awakened something that was now trying to make its presence known? Emily hastily closed the session, but the atmosphere changed. As we left the prison, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever spirit had attached itself to me was still there, lurking in the shadows. Jake and I couldn't sleep that night, haunted by the memory of that ghostly encounter. There are still parts of me that wonders if this was a setup somehow, but there was definitely no one behind us in that room. That's the story of how a birthday ghost walk turned into a night of terror. I hope you find it as spine-chilling as we did. And remember, sometimes it's better to leave the ghosts of the past undisturbed. Let me start this story by saying I never believed in the paranormal before. I was raised Christian in a home of very religious parents. We didn't believe in ghosts, unless you count the Holy Spirit, so that meant I wasn't able to watch any horror movies, nor was I allowed to read paranormal books of any kind. That included friendly kid wizards, ghost stories, you get the picture. So when my friend Arnold invited me over to his place to watch the newest released horror movie about ghosts, I was psyched. And since Arnold's parents were also good friends with my parents, they allowed me to go over to their home and trusted us to keep ourselves entertained for the night. They even gave us Bibles, believing we were going to be studying passages all night together. Spoiler alert, we didn't. When I got to Arnold's home, he led me into his basement and told me he had a surprise to show me. Something that a friend of ours from middle school snagged for him from his parents' New Age shop. I'm not going to lie, I expected a lot of things, but when he pulled out a Ouija board, that wasn't one of them. I'd never seen one in person before, only heard some kids mentioning them before, and I was hesitant. Hesitant because, although I would have considered myself agnostic at the time, I still felt like I was mocking the big guy upstairs by playing with something that was said to be evil. Again, being 12 and bored, it didn't take too long for Arnold to convince me to play with the board. Arnold explained how to use the board and went over the rules for using it. Or rather, he went over what we weren't supposed to do. If you've never used a Ouija board, the rules are simple. Never play alone, turn the planchette 3 times before using it, never take your hands off of it, never ask questions about death, and always, always say goodbye. So can you guess what we did? Yeah, we did everything you weren't supposed to do. I mean, I'm sure you're not surprised, but at the time, it was exciting to not follow the rules and be bad, even if it was just using the board the way we wanted. We broke rule after rule, laughing the whole time as we asked it stupid and taunting questions. After a while, we got bored, and, without saying goodbye, we chucked the board into its box and started getting ready for sleep. It was when we were getting into our sleeping mats that the light in the basement started flickering for no reason. Arnold and I were scared at first, but the electricity at his house was known for acting up, so we didn't think much of it. But then the knocking started happening. 3 knocks, followed by a short silence, before 3 more knocks. And yeah, that freaked us out a bit. We decided to go upstairs and get as far away from the board as possible and sleep in Arnold's room. When nothing else happened, Arnold and I talked about the summer break coming up before we both fell asleep. My sleep, at first, was pleasant, and I didn't have any issues. But my dream, which started with me riding a bike through the clouds, shifted quickly into something much more sinister. In my dream, the sky turned red, and my bike lowered to the ground and vanished. I was left standing in the middle of a vacant cornfield with no end in sight, and I ran through it trying to find my way out. But I never did, no matter how much I ran or for how long. I remember stopping in my dream, out of breath, and panicking when something grabbed my shoulder and turned me around. A humanoid creature that had no face but was completely covered in blood laughed at me and raised their clawed hands at me. I screamed and turned at the last second to run, but its razor-sharp claws bit into my back, and I screamed as I awoke. I was shaking when I woke up, and when I saw Arnold, he was also shaking and crying as he tried to tell me something. But he was so hysterical that I couldn't hear what he was saying. That's when pain registered in my head, and I winced, reaching behind my back to rub against the searing pain. When I touched something wet, I screamed, instantly realizing what it was. Blood. I was bleeding from a wound on my back where the creature in my dream clawed me. That's when I realized what Arnold was trying to tell me. He was telling me about the claw mark on his back that was bleeding as well. Arnold's parents came in after hearing us, and when we told them what had happened, they called my parents, and I got the lecture of a lifetime. Then they called a friend who was a priest. The priest came and performed a cleansing ritual on us both before he took the Ouija board away. I don't know what he did with the board, but whatever he did didn't help stop the dreams. For years, I kept having the dreams of that creature. For years, I had to run from it, scared that if it caught me in my sleep, I'd never wake up. It's been 10 years since I had one of those dreams, and I think I'm safe. But that doesn't stop me from wondering, are the dreams a fragment of my PTSD mind? Or is there something otherworldly that still craves my soul and won't stop until it gets it? My husband Tom and I moved into our first apartment together back in June. He'd chosen it, of course, and he assured me that it would be everything I'd ever wanted. It wasn't. I expected something modern and well-furnished. Instead, we got a building that was over half a century old, but with none of the historical charm that you'd expect. The walls were crumbling brick, and the electricity flickered and blacked out constantly. It was a dump. I tried to make the most of it, of course. I assured Tom that I was happy with his choice, but deep down, I felt a sense of revulsion at the whole place, as if the walls themselves didn't want us there. Because I worked from home, I spent a lot more time in the apartment than Tom did, alone, silently wishing that he'd change his mind and relocate us to somewhere else. The noises didn't start until a few weeks after the move. At first, I thought it was nothing, just little creaks and groans from the walls. That was typical of an old building, right? It was always worse in the daytime, though, when I was alone. Slowly, the noises got worse, often interrupting my Zoom meetings and distracting me from my reports. Then, one day, the noises changed completely. They turned into whispers, unintelligible at first, but then clearer. The house was whispering my name over and over, followed by another word, something that sounded a lot like coven. I tried to tell Tom, but he just thought I was being difficult. Things very quickly devolved into an argument, and I had to suck it up and promise never to mention it again. I didn't know anyone else in the city, so I didn't have anyone else to talk to. I was trapped, and the apartment walls felt like they were closing in. Then one night, I was tossing and turning in my sleep when Tom shook me awake. "Eric?" he said. "What's wrong?" I honestly didn't know. As soon as I woke up, my dream had completely faded from my memory. "I don't know, Tom," I said. "I guess I was having a nightmare." "No," he told me. "You were awake. You kept repeating my name." I knew right away that it wasn't my voice he'd heard. It was the apartment. He'd finally heard the whispers too. I tried to explain that to him, but he refused to listen to me. Our old argument restarted, this time even worse than before. Tom screamed at me to grow up, and I angrily took my pillow and left to go sleep on the couch. I'd never spent the night in our living room before, so I didn't know that the whispers would be so loud. They thrummed against the walls, waiting for minutes at a time, just long enough for me to fall asleep before they could jar me back awake. "Eric," the voices said. "Coven." This went on all night long. The next day, I called in sick to work. I was severely sleep deprived, and I knew I couldn't attend any of my Zoom meetings without accidentally dozing off. Instead, I got on my computer and Googled our address. There had to be something here, something dark from the past. I knew what the word coven meant, so I tried to see if our building had any connection with witches or cults. Maybe the previous tenants had dabbled in something supernatural, something that had somehow soaked its darkness into our walls. Of course, the whispers came back. "Eric, coven. Eric, coven." Over and over. I even tried to record the sounds with my phone, but when I played back the audio, I couldn't hear anything. The Google search turned into a dead end. Our building was old, but it didn't seem to have any connections with witchcraft. All I could find about the apartment's previous tenants was a young couple who'd lived here right before we moved in. The husband was named Richard, the wife Emily. I searched for their names and found that Richard had since moved to Florida, but I couldn't find any information about his wife. It was like she disappeared. That evening, I was making dinner for Tom, like I always did, when he came home from work. He seemed particularly angry, shouting at me for refusing to clean up the place during my day off work. I didn't understand why he'd gotten so angry so fast, but he'd been doing that a lot lately. Before we moved here, he'd never treated me with such disrespect. Then, as I was pulling the lasagna out of the oven, I heard the voice once again. "Eric, coven." It sounded more insistent than ever. Tom was standing a few feet away, so I knew he must have heard it too. I asked him about it, and he became completely unhinged. "Eric," he said, "there are no voices in the walls! Jesus, you're just never happy, are you?" He was standing by the kitchen island, his hand resting on our block of knives. For a horrible second, I thought that he would grab it and attack me. I really did. There was something in his eyes, something unrecognizable. And that's when I realized that I'd been misunderstanding the voices this whole time. The words were blending together, always the same. They weren't saying coven at all. They were saying Eric, oven. So I bent down and felt along the edges of our oven. It wasn't attached to the wall, so I disconnected the gas and started pulling the oven out of its nook. Tom demanded to know what I was doing. He really was holding the knife this time. His anger was rising even more. But I ignored him and kept going. I pulled the oven away from the wall and looked just behind. There, just above the floor, was a hole in the wall. Something was hidden in the darkness. I took a deep breath and reached inside. My hands brushed against something hard and crusted. "What the hell are you doing?" Eric screamed. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I grabbed my phone and shined its light into the hole. There, stuffed away behind the wall, was a dead body. Emily, the woman who used to live here, the woman who disappeared, the woman who had been warning me over and over to look behind the oven. I felt her husband had murdered her, probably over some stupid domestic argument, and I knew that whatever spirit she left behind had been calling to me, trying to ask for help. I called the police right away and explained what I'd found. Eventually, they tracked down her husband in Florida and arrested him for the murder. After that, the whispering stopped. But we didn't stay in that apartment much longer after that. Tom wanted to put all this behind him, but I refused to stay in that place anymore. We found a different, more modern place on the other side of the city. And the strangest thing of all, once we moved out, Tom's anger completely disappeared. It was as if the anger from the past was leaking into him, but outside of the apartment, we stopped arguing. Our lives went back to normal.